zokanti veloy roisi tzadik nezov veloy roisi tzadik nezov v'zaroy mevakesh lochem nar hoisi gam zokanti veloy roisi tzadik nezov veloy roisi tzadik nezov v'zaroy mevakesh lochem Hashem ois li'amoyitei Hashem ois li'amoyitei Hashem yevorech es amois b'sholom Hashem ois li'amoyitei Hashem ois li'amoyitei Hashem yivorech es amois b'shalom nar hoisi gam zokanti veloy roisi tzadik nezov veloy roisi tzadik nezov v'zaroy mevakesh lochem Hashem ois li'amoyitei Hashem ois li'amoyitei Hashem yivorech es amois b'shalom Hashem ois li'amoyitei Hashem ois li'amoyitei Hashem yivorech es amois b'shalom
Good evening, and it brings down that traditionally we don't say a Gute Vach on Motzei Shabbos as we go into Tisha B'Av. So thank you for joining us for tonight's program. We're going to begin the program with Ma'ariv, which we'll lead together and daven together, although not a halachic minyan, but nonetheless the Kehillah davening together and supporting one another through our daily Mincha Ma'ariv service on Zoom. And then that will lead into Eicha, approximately at 7 o'clock. And then we look forward to welcoming our guests and having our full Tisha B'Av program with our guest speaker, Laureen Nussbaum. So please join us as we daven Ma'ariv together. I will be leading the process. We'll start in just a moment. We start on page 256 in the Art Scroll Sidurim. Adonai Hoshia Hamelech Yaneinu B'Yom Koreinu. Baruch atah Adonai hamariv aravim. Kihem chayenu v'rechameinu v'hem yegeyem b'loyla v'vos chlisas mimenu loyla min baruch atah Adonai ohev amoy Yisrael. Yisrael. Avto is Adonai lecha b'chol v'avcha b'chol nafshecha b'chol me'idecha v'yad devarim ha'ila sh'onechim tebecha hayom. Allah v'avcha v'shinantam l'vanecha v'dibarta b'am b'shivtecha b'visecha v'lechtecha v'derecha b'shach v'chol b'kumecha. Vazav da diganecha b'sirushecha b'yitzarecha. Yema tarva dom malay sitin zebola. B'nei atem oizamis b'nei chen medaber b'am b'shivtecha b'visecha v'lechtecha v'derecha b'shach. Mevinechem al ha'adama she'ishba adinu v'zechem azus v'hem k'miyah shemayim al ha'aretz v'yem adinu meshuleim v'dam v'yisrael. Al kam v'evidem derech al asrim al Tisha. There's a surah acher v'avechem achareinechem asher atem zaynim achareichem. This group of us seems to come to this way. Here is Mitzrayim liyes lachem Elohim. Emes v'emena kol zois v'kaim aleinu ki adinu lehein v'ein ze los v'ein. Umachus eviratzen kiblu aleihem Moshe b'nei Yisrael l'chanu shira v'simcha rabba v'yamru chula mi chamoicha. Achus lecha rol v'necha b'kayam ifnei Moshe ze Eli anu v'yamru. V'nemar kifod Adonai es Yaakov v'geolim yad chazak mimenu baruch atah Adonai kol Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai shemez amo Yisrael lo'ad. Adonai v'asai tiftoch. Atachonantano. Okay, at this point in time, we don't actually conclude Mariv just yet. We're going to conclude Mariv after Eicha and some of the lamentations, the short lamentations that we say afterwards. But before we begin Eicha, just to remind everybody that it is customary to light a candle as part of the Motzei Shabbos ritual, we don't make Havdalah tonight. Havdalah is actually made on Sunday night with wine alone. And the concluding bracha of Hamavdil ben Kodesh L'chol, that will be said on Sunday night. Tonight, we only light our candle. So we can give a minute or so. If you want to take a candle and light a candle, as I've done myself. Okay, you can't actually fulfill the obligation with my candle, but either you can do it now or you can do it later as well. And all we say on Motzei Shabbos right now is the bracha of candle lighting from the Havdalah, but that's it. So you can hear my bracha, although you can't fulfill your obligation from that. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei ma'orei ha'esh. And that's it. The rest of Havdalah will be done on Motzei Shabbos, on Sunday night after the fast. Okay, we are ready to begin Eicha. And I'm going to hand over to Rabbi Goldman to introduce and to run Eicha here.
Thank you, Rabbi Stern. A little bit complicated to find a small chair and get the camera to focus a little bit lower than normal. So until tomorrow midday, we sit on low chairs. It should be less than 30 centimeters high. Can be comfortable, but it has to be low, like when people are in mourning in Shiva. So we begin with Eicha. I'm not sure who else is sharing. Rabbi Stern, you'll call on the others to share.
So Rabbi Goldman, Jared Abelson will join us for Perek Gimel, and Stephen Fredman will join us for Perek Daled, and then you will conclude Perek Hey.
Okay. So Eicha is the Book of Lamentations. It's part of Tanakh. And I saw a good word today. Now, there are those who use a real Megillah scroll of parchment for the various Megillahs throughout the year. Everybody uses it for Purim, for Megillat Esther. But there are people, based on the Vilna Gaon's ruling, who held that for all the Megillahs, you should have for Shir Hashirim and for Ruth and Kohelet, you should also have a proper Megillah. And there are such things. You don't see them all that frequently, but there are such things. So someone said, why don't we have a proper Megillah for Eicha? And he said, because you can't just pick up a Megillah, someone has to write the Megillah. And it takes time to write such a Megillah. So can you imagine all this time someone's writing a Megillah in anticipation of Tisha B'Avs of the future? Where's faith? Mashiach is coming. You're gonna spend so much time with such a lack of hope and a lack of faith that you're gonna need a Megillah. So that's why we don't use a Megillah. So you can follow in whatever book you have. If you have a Kinnis book, or if you have a stone edition of the Art Scroll Chumash at home, you'll find it in the back. I don't have the exact page number handy.
We'll also share it on the screen as we go along here.
Oh, okay. Now we're really sophisticated. Okay, so Eicha Yoshva Bodod. Jeremiah the prophet laments the situation. He was the one who prophesied that the temple will be destroyed. The people arrested him. He was thrown into prison. He was treated terribly. They didn't want to hear the truth that they had sinned, and unfortunately were bringing this upon themselves. Eicha, alas, Yoshvo Bodod, she sits in solitude. Who is she? Jerusalem. The city that was great with people has become like a widow. The greatest among nations, the princess among provinces, has become but a tributary. She weeps bitterly in the night. A tear is on her cheek. She has no comforter from all her lovers. All her friends have betrayed her and become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile because of suffering and harsh toil. She dwelt among the nations but found no rest. All her pursuers overtook her in narrow straits. The roads of Zion are in mourning for lack of festival pilgrims. All her gates are desolate, her priests sigh, her maidens are aggrieved, and she herself is embittered. And so it goes on. So we'll read it in the traditional mournful chant. Megillah of Purim is a lively, joyous trop. We have a few exceptions where the situation looks dire and we move into echotrop. But here, the whole thing is in its unique echo cantillation. Echo yoshvo vodo, oi rabos yom, oi so ki almono, rabosi vagoyi, sorosi bambinois, oi so loma. Bochoi sivke balaylo, v'dimoso alechayo, ein lo menachem mikol haveho, koreyeho bogduvo, oyu lo liyoyevi. Gol so yudo meyoini umeroi vabaydo, hi yoshvo vagoyim, loy motzo monoya, koroy feo hisiguho, bein hametzorim. Dar chetziyoy navelois, mibli boe moye, kol shioreho shoymemin, koyaneho nenochim, psuloy seonu gois v'himar lo. Oyu tzoreho leroi shoy veho sholu, ki adinoi hoigo aroi psholeho, oy lo leho, olchu shvi lifnei tzor. Vayetze mi basio in kol hadoro, oyu soreho, ki ayolim loy motzu mireh, vayelchu v'loy choyach lifnei roidei. Zochro Yerushalayim, Yemei on Yom Rudeho, Koel Machmudeho, Asher Hoyu Mimei Kedem, B'nefoil Amo B'yadzo, V'yein Zelo, Rohu Atzorim Sochaku, Al Mishbateho, Ched Choto Yerushalayim, Al kein l'nido yoso, kol mechabdeho hiziluho kiro ervoso, gam hinencho vatoshovocho, tumoso bishuleho, loy zochro achriso, vateret ploim, eimenachem lo, v'yei Adonai esoni, Kigdil lovoye, Yodai poraso, al komach madeho, Kiroaso goyim bo mikdosho, Asher tziviso, lo yovoyu vakol lo. Kol amo nenochim v'akshim lechem, nosnu machmadehem, B'yoichel hoshiv nofesh, Riyei Adonai v'habito, Ki oyisi zoy leilo, Loy aleichem, Kol oivrei dor derech, Habitu riyu, Im yesh machoy kemachoy vi, asher oy lali, asher hoy godinoy, beyoy mcharoy napoy, mimoroy, sholachesh beyatzmoisai vayideno, poras reshes liraglai, heshivani yochoy, nisonani shoy meimo, kol hayoim dovo, niskad, oil pshoai biyodo, yistorgu, olu al tzavori, ekshil koichi, nisonani adonoi, bidei lo yuchal kum. Silo, cholabirai, adonoi bikirbi, korolai, moye lishboy bachuroi, gaz dorach adonoi, liv sulas, bas yudo, aleile ani boichio, Eini, Yerdomayim, Kirochak mimeni, Menachem meshiv nafshi, Hoyu vonai shoy meimin, Ki govar oye, Perisot ziyoin biyodeho, Ei menachem lo, Tzivo Adonai, Leakoi Svivov Tzorov, Hoiso Yerushalayim, Lenido Beinehem, Tzadiku, Adonai Kifiu Morisi, Shimuno Chol Hoamim, Oreo Machoivim, Suloisai uvachurai elchu vashevi. Korosi lamahavai heimorimuni. Koyanai uskenai bohir govo. Kivikshu oichelomoi. V'yoshivu es nafsho. V'yei adinoi kitzar li. Meyai chomar moru. Nepach libi bikirbi, ki moroi morisi, michud shiklo cherev, babayis kamoves, shomu ki nenochoni, ei menachem li, koloi vai, shomura osisosu, yato osiso, Eveisa yoim koroso, veyeyu chomo voyni. Tovoi chorosam lefonecho, veyoy leilomoi. Kasher oilalto li, al kol pshavoi. Kiraboy san choisai, vilibi davoi.
We move on now to Perek Beis. Goldman.
I'll just add that you can see that this chapter that we just read and the next chapters all go according to the Aleph bet. You see, Eicha starts with the Aleph, the first verse is Aleph, second verse starts with Bet, and so on. So we're basically going through the whole catalog of woe. All the tzoros that befell the Jewish people, the destruction of the temple, the razing of Jerusalem, the exile of its people, from A to Z, from Aleph to Tov, all the tzoros are recounted here. Chapter 2.
Echa Yaiv Bapoi Adonai Astion Hishlich Mishamayim Eretz Tiferes Yisrael Lezachar Hadem Raglav B'Yom Apoi Bila Adonai V'Loi Choma Eis Kol Ois Yaakov Haras bevrasoi mifterei bas Yehuda higia la'aretz chila mamlacha b'sareha gada b'chariyav kol keren Yisrael heshivachar yeminai mipnei oyev vayivar v'Yaakov ke'esh lehava achlas aviv darach kashdoi koyev Nitav Yeminoi Ketzor Vayaharoi Kol Machmadei Oyin V'Oyel Bastion Shavach Koesh Chamasoi Haya Adonai Koyev Bila Yisrael Bila Kol Armoniseha Shiches Nivtzarav Vayere Bevas Yehuda Tanya V'Aniya Vayachmois kagan sukoi shiches moyadoi shikach Adonai b'tzion mayei b'Shabbos vayinat v'zamapoi melech v'choyein zonach Adonai mizbechoi niyem mikdashoi hiskir b'yadoi v'choymois armoniseha kol nasnu b'beis Adonai kiyom moyed Chashav Adonai lahashchiz chemas bastion natakov leishiv yadoi mibaleya vayavel chel v'choyma yachtav umlalum tavu v'aretz shareha ibad v'shibad bericheha malko v'sareha v'agoyim ein Torah gam neviyeha amatzu chazoin me'adonai Yeshvu l'oretz yidmuzik nevas tzion helu al afol arisham chagru sakim hiridu l'oretz rishon besulais Yerushalayim kalu v'admois einai chamar meru me'ai nishbach l'oretz kevedi al shever basami v'yatef oleil b'yeinei kibirchei bois kirya L'moisom yemru aye dagon vayayin v'tatvam kechala b'chei b'sir v'ishtapech nafsham el cheik imoisom ma'idech ma'adam elach habas Yerushalayim ma'ashvelach v'nachamech Besulas Basion, Ki Gadol Kayom, Shivrech Miyap Irpolach, Neviayich, Chazulach, Shav Vesafel, Velegilu Alavinech, Lashiv Shvuseich, Veyechazulach, Masois Shav Maduchim, Safku Alaich Kapayim, Koloivre Derech, Sharku v'yani Risham Albas Yerushalayim Hazois ha'ir Shemru kilulas yoifi Masois v'chol ha'aretz Patzu alayich pihem kol oyevaich Sharku v'yacharku shein Amru bilanu Ach ze hayom Shikivinu matzanu ra'inu Asa Adonai asher zamam Bitzayim rasoy asher tiva mimei kedem haras v'loy chamol v'yisamach olayich oyev herim keren zarayich tzach liba mel Adonai chemas basiyoin haridi chanach al dima yemam v'layla al titni fugas loch al tidoim as avonech kumi roini v'layla l'roish ashmurois Shivrichi chamayim libech noichach pnei Adonai Sei elov kapayich al nefesh oilalayich patufim berav berosh kol chutzos Rei Adonai v'habita lemi oilal tokoi Im tochal no nashim piryam oilei tipuchim Im yareg b'migdash Adonai koyem v'navi Shachvu Loretz Chutois Nar V'Zarkein V'Sulasai V'Achurai Naflo V'Charev Harak Dobiyem Apecha Tavachta Lechamalta Tikra Chayoy Mayem Megurai Misaviv V'Loi Haya B'Yom Afadinoi Palit B'Sarid Ashitipachti B'Ribisi Evichilam. Rabbi Goldman Yudi puts in his apologies, so we're going to move on to Perek Gimel, and Jared will lead this Perek.
I just want to say, we just read a famous line, Shifchi Kamayim Libech. That's what we're doing here. You know, the famous story with Napoleon. He was walking through the streets of Paris and he heard moaning and groaning and crying and said, "What's going on?" He was going past a shul on Tisha B'Av. They told him the people are weeping, they're lamenting. What are they crying about? What happened? He said the temple was destroyed. He said, when did it happen? He said about 1800 years ago. And he said, well, people who have such a memory and haven't forgotten their loss will surely live to see the temple rebuilt. So we mourn. Kumi Roini Balayla, we just read, Rabbi Stern read the last lines, pour out your heart, arise, cry out at night, pour out your heart like water, lift up your hands to Hashem. In this next chapter, there's a famous line, and first of all, this chapter is different. We spoke about the Aleph Bet. This one is the Aleph Bet in triple. 3 verses beginning with Aleph, then 3 verses beginning with Bet, and so on. And when it comes to Chet, the 8th letter, verse 22 in this chapter 3, the famous line, Chazdei Hashem ki lo samnu, is a well-known song to these words, ki lo cholu rachamot, which is translated, Hashem's kindness surely has not ended, nor are his mercies exhausted. That's the simple meaning. Another interpretation is Chazdei Hashem ki lo samnu, by the chesed of Hashem that we have not ended, that we have not been destroyed, the Jewish people. There's a famous phrase that it says that Hashem took out his wrath, his anger, on the wood and the stones, meaning he destroyed the temple, but he does not destroy Am Yisrael. We were exiled, we suffered, but we didn't cease to exist. The chesed of Hashem is that he let out his anger on the wood and the stones of the Beit HaMikdash, of the building, but the Jewish people survived. And the Jewish people are still here, and please God, the Jewish people will merit to see the rebuilding of the third temple speedily in our day. Chapter 3.
אני הגבר רעני בשבט עברתו, אותי נהג, ויולע חושך ולא אור, אך בי ישוב, יפוך ידו כל היום, גילה בשרי ואורי, שיבר עצמותיי, פנה עליי, ויקף ראש ותלה, מחשכים מושיבני כמתי עולם, הדר בדי, ולא אצייך בית נחשתי, גם כי אזעק ואשבע, סתם תפילתי, הדר דרכי בגזית, נתיבותי איבה, טובי אורי והוא לי, ארי במסתרים, דרכי סורר, ויפשכני שמני שומם, הרח קשתו ויציבני, המטרה לחץ, היביא בכליותיי, פני אשפתו, הייתי שחוק לכל עמי, נגינתם כל היום. הספיעני במרורים, הרבני לנה, ויגרס בחצץ שיני, הכפישני באפר, ותזנח משלום, נפשי נשיתי טובה, ואומר עבד נצחי, תאכלתי מאדוני, זכרון ימרודי לנה בראש, זכור תזכור, ותשוח עלי נפשי, זאת אשיב ליבי על כן אוכיל, חסדי אדוני כי לא תמנו, כי לא חלו רחמיו, חדשים לבקרים, רבה אמונתך. אלקי אדוני אמרה נפשי, על כן אוכיל לו. טוב אדוני לקובב, לנפש תדרשנו. טוב ויחיל ודומם, לתשועת אדוני. טוב לגבר כי שאול בנעוריו, ישב בדד וידום, כי נטל עליו. ייתן בעפר פיהו, אולי יש תקווה. ייתן למכהו לחי, יספע בחרפה, כי לא יזנח לעולם אדוני. כי אם הוגה בריחם קרוב חסדיו, כי לא ינם מליבו, ויגע בני איש, לדכא תחת רגליו, כל אסירי ארץ, להטות משפט דבר, נגד פני עליון. לבית אדם בריבו, אדוני לא ראה. מזה אמר ותהי, אדוני לא ציווה. מפי עליון לא תצא הרעות והטוב. מה יתונן אדם חי על החטאיו, נפצע דרכינו ונחקרה, ונשובה עד אדוני. נישא לבבינו אל כפיים, אל אלוהים. אנחנו פשענו מרינו, אתה לא סלחת. סקות באף ותרדפנו, הרגת לא חמלת. סקות בענן לך, מעבור תפילה. שכי ומאוס, תשימנו בקרב עמים. פצו עלינו פיהם כל אויבינו. פחד ופחד, היה לנו השט והשבר. פלגי מים תראיני, על שבר בתמי. איני נגרע, ולא תדמם מעין הפוגות, עד ישקיף ויראה אדוני משמיים. איני עוללה לנפשי מכל בנות עירי, סוד צדוני כציפור אויבי חינם, צמתו ועבור חיי, ידעו אבן בי. טפו מים על ראשי, אמרתי נגזרתי, קראתי שמך אדוני, מבור תחתיות, קולי שמעת, אל תעלה מאוזנך, לרווחתי לשבתי, קרבת ביום אקראך, אמרת אל תירא, רבת אדוני, ריבי נפשי גאלת חיי. ראית אדוני אהבתי, שפת משפטי, ראית כל נקמתם, כל מחשבותם לי, שמעת חרפתם אדוני, כל מחשבותם עלי, שפתי קמי וגיונם עלי כל היום. שבטם וקימתם הביטה, אני מנגינתם, אשיב להם גמול, אדוני כמעשה ידיהם, תיתן להם מגינת לב, תהלתך להם, תרדוף ביעף ותשמידם, מתחת שמי אדוני.
Did you notice something strange in the sequence of the letters? You may have noticed in this chapter and the previous one, the pei comes before the ayin. Now in the Aleph Bet, ayin comes before pei. Samach, ayin, pei, tzadik. Here in Eicha, the verses beginning with pei precede the verses beginning with ayin, which is the opposite sequence of the alphabet. The commentaries say that it goes back, one answer is goes back to the spies. The first Tisha B'Av in history that was a disaster was when the spies came back and gave the negative report of Israel in the days of Moshe, and the people wept that night that they have to go into this ferocious land to be devoured by these terrifying warriors in Canaan. And Hashem was very displeased, giving you my precious promised land. You don't think I can help you out? And he said, mark my word, you cried for nothing. This day, Tisha B'Av, will become a day of weeping for generations. B'chiyah ledorot, as indeed it has. The days on which both our temples were destroyed and quite a few other national calamities that have befallen us. So the spies put their pei before their ayin. Pei means the mouth. Ayin is the eye. They put their mouth to what they did not see. And they painted a false picture of the Holy Land, which caused the people to weep. And that's one answer given here, why the pei precedes the ayin. Chapter 4, Stephen.
Eicha yuam zahav yishne akesimatoy tishtapeichna avnei kodesh v'roish kol chutzois v'nei tzion hayekarim hamsuloim v'hapos Eicha nechshavu l'nivnei cheres maaseh yedei yotzer Gam tanim chalutzu shad heiniku goreyen Basami leachzor kayenim bamidbar. Tovak l'shoinyonek el chikoya batzamo. Oilalim shalu lechem poireis ein lohem. Hoichelim lama'adanim noshamu bachutzois. Haemunim alei soilo kivuku ashpatois. Vayigdal avoin basami meichatas sedoim. Hafuchoch moiragav loichol choluvo yodoyim. Zakun zireha misheleg etzachu meichalov. Admu etzem mipeninim sapir gizrasom. Choshach mishachor ta'oram loy nikaru bachutzois. Sofa doirom alatzmom yovei shayachovetz. Toivim hayu chalelei cherev mei chalelei ra'ov. Shehem yazuvu mutukarim mitruvois sahadai. Yedei noshim rachamonios vishulu yaldeihen. Hayu levarois lamoi b'shevet basami. Kilo adinoi es chamasoi shofach charoi napoi. Vayates eish v'tzioin v'atzoi chal yosoi roiseho. Lo yeminu malchei eretz kol yoshavei sevel. Ki yavoi etzar voyei b'sharei Yerushalayim. Meichatois nevieho avinois koyhaneho. Asher pechim bekirbo tam tzadikim. Na'u iverim b'achutzois negoyalu v'atom. V'lo yuchelu yigau bilbushayhem. Suru tamei karu lavoy. Suru al tigau ki natsu kahamno. Amru vagoyim lo yosifu lagu. Hene yadinoy chilkom lo yosif labitom. Hene choyhanim lo nasau uzkainim lo chonanu. Oidainu techilenu ainainu el ezrasainu havel. Vitzipiasainu tzipinu elgo yelo yoshia. Sadus yadainu mileches birchoy v'seidu. Karav kitzainu malu yamainu kivo kitzainu. Kalim hayu roidafeinu minishrei shamoyim. Al hearim tulakunu b'amidbar arabulanu. Ruach hapeinu Mashiach Adonai nilakad b'shchiso yisom. Asher amarnu b'tzilo nichye v'goyim. Sisi v'simchi pasedoim yosheves peretz utz. Gam olayich tabor kois tishkeri v'sis ari. Tam avineich bastion lo yosef lahagloseich. Pokad avineich pasedoim gilo al chatoisoyim.
We conclude with chapter 5, which is short, and it's not according to the alphabet.
Sorry, Rabbi Goldman. I just, by mistake, you've been muted. Just unmute yourself as you're introducing Perek Hay. Thank you.
So chapter 5 is the concluding chapter. It's shorter. We don't go through all the 22 letters of the alphabet. There are 22 verses, but not in Aleph-Beis sequence. And we end with the hopeful note, Hashivenu Hashem Elechu v'Nashuva. Bring us back to you, Hashem, and we shall return. Chadesh Yomenu Kekedem, renew our days as of old. And that verse is recited by the leader, but then recited by the congregation. So you'll all have a chance to say it out loud. Don't think I'll hear you, but you can still say it out loud. So we begin chapter 5. Remember, Hashem, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our houses to foreigners. We become orphans. Our mothers like widows. And why do you ignore us eternally, forsake us for so long? Our heart was faint, our eyes dimmed. Mount Zion, which lie desolate, foxes prowling over it. Okay. So even today, although we have access to Yerushalayim, but unfortunately the Temple Mount, there aren't foxes, there are other things. We don't have the freedom as we pray to have very soon. Chapter 5. Zechoir Adonai mehoyolonu habito reis cheposeinu nachaloseinu nefchol izorim boteinu linochrim yisoimim hoyinu v'yeino imoiseinu ki almono meimeinu b'chesed shosinu Eitzeinu b'mechir yogoyu Al tzavoreinu nidofnu Yogainu V'loi hunachlonu Mitzrayim nosanu yod Ashur v'zboy alochem Avayseinu chotu v'yainom V'anachnu avoynoisem sovonu Avodim moshbuvonu Poirek ein miodom, v'navsheinu novi lachmeinu, mipnei cherev hamidbor. Oireinu kisanu nichmoru, mipnei zalafois rovot. Noshim b'tzioininu, b'sulois b'yorei Yehudo. Sorim b'yodom nislu, Praise Kainim Loinedoru Bachurim Tchoinoso Uniorim Koetz Kosholu Zekainim Mishar Shavosu Bachurim Inginoso Shovas Mesois Libenu Nepach Lievel Mechoileinu Noflo Ateres Roishenu Oy no lonu kichotonu alze oyodoveli beinu alele choshu eineinu al hatzion sheshomein shualim hilchuvo ato adoinoi liolom teishei kisachol ledor vodo Lama lo netzach tishkocheinu, tazveinu liyorech yomim. Hashiveinu Adonai elecho v'noshuvo, chadesh yomeinu kekedem. Ki ima ois ma'astonu, kotzavto leinu ad miyoy. All of us together. Hashiveinu Adonai elecho v'noshuvo, chadesh yomeinu kekedem.
Rabbi Goldman. There are some kinnis that are normally said on the night time of Tisha B'Av before we conclude the service. We are running a bit over schedule, so I'm going to ask those that wish to say it. If you have your kinnis in front of you, you may say it quietly to yourselves. It's a couple of pages, and it goes towards the end, Ba'ata Kadosh, which is also said on Motzei Shabbos, Saturday night, leading into Aleinu L'Shabeach, which ends the Mariv service for evening of Tisha B'Av. We are going to move on to our program, as was publicized. Just give me a moment as we get ready for this. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining our Tisha B'Av program. We have a very special guest who has joined us this evening to share with us Laureen Nussbaum, or otherwise, when she was born, her name was Hannelore Klein, is a German-born Holocaust survivor who went on to become an American scholar and writer. She was a childhood friend of the famed Anne Frank and extensively studied her renowned diary. Laureen was a professor of foreign languages and literature at the Portland State University, and after retirement, now lectures on the Holocaust and her experiences during World War II. A fascinating person, a fascinating story, and I first of all would like to give thanks to a member of our community, Renee Pomeranitz, who together with her mom Rita and her sister and the family met Laureen in the United States in Seattle. And Renee suggested inviting Laureen already last year, exactly a year ago, July last year. I got Renee's request and an invite, and she put us in touch with Laureen already last year. We've had to find the ideal time. Not that Tisha B'Av is ever an ideal time, but we've had the opportunity to engage and to talk and chat to Laureen over the last few days. And as I was explaining to Laureen, Tisha B'Av is not just a day that we think about the temples, the 2 temples that were destroyed. It's a time that we think about destruction and persecution and exile throughout history. It's a time to focus for a moment and realize the difficult challenges that have come upon us. And in modern times, it's a time that we stop and pause and think about often the calamities and tragedies of the Holocaust, a more modern day Holocaust, a more modern day tragedy for our people. And this is what motivated me to invite Laureen to address us as a Holocaust survivor herself, born in 1927. It's a very special opportunity to have Laureen with us. In my conversations with Laureen, I learned that her father was halachically Jewish, but her mother wasn't, which therefore makes it permissible to invite her today, although in Seattle right now it is Shabbat. And normally, under normal circumstances, we wouldn't be able to invite a Jew or Jewess to address us from the United States while it is Shabbat at this point in time. But as Laureen explained to me, according to Jewish law, she's not considered a Jewess, and therefore that makes it permissible. And we're very happy and grateful that Laureen has accepted our invite. What we'll do this evening is that Laureen will address us and share with us her personal story. The title that we gave tonight was Shedding Our Stars, which in fact is the title of Laureen's book. So I'm sure you'll be looking after or chasing after this book after you've heard Laureen's story. And then we're going to have some time for Q&A and questions to be able to join along. I didn't know this. Renee tells me that Rita, Renee's mum, worked for Laureen's husband's aunt. Okay, so there's quite a connection here between the Pomeranitz family and the Nussbaum family. So without further ado, Laureen, thank you for joining us. I'm now going to hand over to you. You can unmute yourself. Thank you very, very much for joining us this evening.
Okay, I unmuted myself. Hello, and thank you for having me. And I hope you will put up with my German, Dutch, American accent. I wish people would be able to stop me if they have a question, but I don't think that's easy over the Zoom machinery. So I will talk for a while and then I hope there will be questions afterwards. Let me first rectify. I do not know Renee. I only know Rita Pomeranetz, and I know her because my husband and I visited 3 times in Johannesburg. I know that Renee came to Seattle at one point, but we never linked up. So the only member of the Pomeranetz family I know is Rita, who indeed took loving care of my husband's aunt. That's the connection with Johannesburg. All right. I wasn't quite sure whether this was really a book launch or what it is, but I do want to say that the theme of Tisha B'Av, which is grief work on the one hand and resilience on the other hand, sort of fits with my book because there's a lot of grieving in my book. It's about the Holocaust, the way I experienced it, but there's also resilience, or otherwise I wouldn't be here. So that's another link. All right, I will start out with my introduction to the book to give you an idea. In 1992, the exhibit Anne Frank in the World came to Portland, Oregon, where my husband and I had made our home for 30 years. The exhibition was a major event. Some 24 people in the greater Portland area who had lived through the Holocaust were willing to speak about their experiences. They told their stories and answered questions, bringing 72,000 visitors closer to what had happened in Europe under the Nazi regime half a century earlier. I was one of those witnesses. In 1936, my parents emigrated with their 3 daughters from Frankfurt to Amsterdam. We, the Kleins, settled in the same neighborhood as Anne Frank's family, whom we had known in Frankfurt. Margot Frank, Anne's older sister, was among the first 4,000 Jewish refugees aged 16 to 40 ordered to report for forced labor in Germany. My older sister was served the same summons. Anne had just turned 13, I was almost 15, and my younger sister 12, all 3 of us too young under the edict to be sent away. It is well known from Anne's diary that the day after Margot received the summons, the Frank family went into hiding in the back quarters of the Otto Frank's business. They managed to hold on for 25 months, thanks to the loving care of Mr. Frank's clerical staff and to the unwavering support of his business partners. Anne wrote vividly about their secret life up in the attic. Sadly, Otto Frank was the only one of the family to survive the war. Anne and Margot died from typhus in Bergen-Belsen, and Mrs. Frank had succumbed to exhaustion in Auschwitz. Upon his return to Amsterdam, despite his tremendous loss, Mr. Frank was happy to find that his business partners and his office staff had all survived the horrors, and that my family still lived in the same apartment where he had last visited us 3 years before. How had we escaped the dance of death, he asked at the time, a question repeated again and again whenever I speak about the Holocaust. There were other good Germans beside Oskar Schindler with his now famous list. Thanks to one of them, a little-known lawyer named Hans Kallmayr, my family and thousands of other Jews survived. Hans Kallmayr saved the lives of more Jews than Schindler. Among many others, my family and I owe Kallmayr a great unpayable debt. I fervently hope that this book, which blends my family's history with his, will help to bring him the international recognition he so amply deserves. So that's the introduction of the book, to the book. And since time is short, we had a very late start. I just have to cut here and there what I'm going to say. I was 5 years old.
Laureen, sorry to pause you, I know it's morning by you. We've got time. Don't feel that we are pressured for time. You may be, but we're not.
Okay, well, good. Thank you. That's good. That's good to know. So I was only 5 years old when Hitler came to power. We had left a comfortable middle-class life in Frankfurt. My father was a member of the liberal synagogue, the West End Synagogue, which is a large and beautiful synagogue. My mother sang in the synagogue choir. And we considered ourselves a Jewish family, although I very well knew that my mother's mother was a Roman Catholic. I often went to Mass with her. I loved Mass because I loved the smell of incense and the whole theater that goes with a Catholic Mass. So from the very beginning, although we considered ourselves Jewish, I also knew that there was more than just a Jewish background in my family. We went to public school, of course, like everybody else. But in the spring of 1935, Jewish children were separated out. We were no longer allowed to go to public school. That's to say, we went to a special wing of the public schools. In my case, my elementary school had quite a number of Jewish children. So we were separated out, sent to a special wing of the school with a special entrance, and we were taught by Jewish teachers, and the major part of the school was non-Jewish, obviously, was taught by non-Jewish teachers. That was in the spring of 1935. By that time, there were ominous signs that life for Jews would be impossible in Germany. So my parents scouted for a place to go and went to Amsterdam, actually, to see what possibilities there would be. They found an apartment in the fall of 1935. And in the spring of 1936, when I was 8 years old, we moved to Amsterdam. The Franks lived in our neighborhood, and I'm pretty sure that my father consulted Mr. Frank about how to set up business in Amsterdam. The Franks had come in 1933. So we went again to mixed public school, adapted very fast to life in the Netherlands, loved it very much because we were very free. Everybody had a bicycle, we could go places by ourselves. My family never had a car, but we could go to all kinds of interesting places and be very independent. Of course, we learned Dutch much faster than our parents. And ever so often when my parents tried to say something in Dutch, we children would whack our fingers and say, you can't say that, that's such and such, which I found a wonderful democratizing experience because our parents had to listen to us. Now that's privilege, you know. And so I experienced that as a positive thing. Life would have been great for us in the Netherlands if the German armies had not invaded the country in May of 1940. It was a 5 days war. The Dutch were no match for the German army. The Germans parachuted in. And when the Dutch didn't surrender fast enough, they actually bombed the center of the city of Rotterdam. And then that's where the Queen and her parliament fled, and the country was surrendered to the Germans. So this is still only May of 1940. Excuse me. In the beginning, there were no major changes. The Germans had hoped to win the hearts and minds of the Dutch population, fellow Germanic people of superior sort, and that the Dutch would generally go along with whatever the Germans wanted from them. Although there were small steps already taken very early. The Jews could not serve in the air raid patrols and other things. They were very soon eased out of public service. but the general Jewish population did not suffer immediately. That only started in January of 1941, about 8 months into the occupation, when Jewish citizens had to register. And I want to read the definitions of who was considered a Jewish resident. Sorry, that the mechanics take a little bit of time. Okay. So it was the Reich Kommissariat who had promulgated, who were considered to be irrefutably, that's a nice word, irrefutably Jewish were people. Well, number one, Jews were all persons whose grandparents included 3 or more full Jews by race. Of course, in South Africa, you know a lot about race too. Secondly, persons with only 2 fully Jewish grandparents are deemed to be Jews if A, they belong to a Jewish religious community on May 9th, 1940, when the Germans marched in, or B, when they were married to a Jew on that same date. Finally, number 3, and that's for me the most important one, a grandparent is deemed a full Jew if he was at any time a member of a Jewish religious congregation. Now, for a racial definition, this is, of course, sheer nonsense, but that's what the rules were in the Netherlands. And so, of course, there were people like my family, where the background was a little murky, who were asking themselves, well, am I or am I not really Jewish according to these rules? Now I have to step back for a moment and talk about Hans Kallmayr, because I haven't mentioned him yet. He was born in Germany, in Osnabrück, northwestern Germany, in 1903. His father was a judge, a very sincerely Lutheran family, sincerely in the sense that they read the Bible every night and that they really believed in being good Christians. Let's put it that way. He wanted to fulfill his father's wish and studied law too. I must say about the Kallmayr family, he was the 3rd boy in this family. His 2 older brothers were both killed during World War I as German soldiers within a few weeks. They were both at the Western Front, and they were both killed in 1918, just before the end of World War I, which made a pacifist out of Hans Kallmayr from the very beginning. I want just to, he was a very thoughtful young man, and I want to read you one quotation from his diary, if I can find it fast enough. Yeah. Well, if I cannot find the quotation fast enough, I think I will just skip it. It was something that I found extremely thoughtful. He wrote, what makes a good person? And he asked himself at age 20, and he said, a good person is something who extends himself or herself and is helpful. It's not the heroic deeds that count, but what counts is be extending yourself and being helpful. So which points to a very thoughtful young man. He never became a member of the Nazi Party, but he had to serve as of the fall of 1939. and he opted for a air scouting command where they would, with binoculars, look for enemy airplanes and report what they see to a central office, and so that the Germans could defend themselves against possible Allied air raids. That was his army job. He couldn't get out of it fast enough, and so he was stationed in the Netherlands in 1940, and one of his lawyer friends worked for the Reichskommissar, the highest civil authority in the Netherlands, German civil authority in the Netherlands. And that fellow said, yes, I have just the right job for you. And he was hired, although he was not a member of the Nazi Party. And he became the person to adjudicate any cases where people claimed that they were not fully Jewish. So he became the crucial person, and in his job description, it was made clear that his decision was final. So whatever he decided, there was no going higher up to get a revision. Now I go back to this definition which I read earlier about who was Jewish and who was not Jewish. Okay. Hans Kalmar was charged with interpreting the registration law in the Netherlands and with settling any doubts as to whether a person was an Aryan, a full Jew, or a part Jew, settled into his new position in the spring of 1941. He had considerable autonomy. Life hung in the balance of his decisions. He soon found ways to use his legal skills in the service of his humane convictions. 3 weeks after he assumed his position, Kalmar spoke up and said that with the way the law was phrased, or the decree was phrased, that people should have the right to refute the assumption that a grandparent was racially Jewish if he or she was a member of a Jewish religious congregation. His reasoning was so persuasive that 3 days later, Reichskommissar Seyss-Inquart adopted Kalmar's argument. So this is where he created the discretion to allow petitioners to substantiate their contention with sworn testimonies and solemn declarations in front of Dutch administrative officials who were usually on the side of the petitioner. If a petitioner claimed that he or she was not or had never been a member of the Jewish community, a district court would summon the secretary of the congregation to refute that claim. Generally, the person summoned would not appear in court, and so the petitioner's claim went unchallenged and hence was accepted by the judge, and hence was accepted by Kalmar. So that was one of the great loopholes. The discretion Kalmar created for his petitioners resulted in more than 5,600 cases of doubtful ancestry, which his office had to adjudicate. In addition, Kalmar permitted petitioners to substantiate their requests as attestations by racial specialists of their own choosing, rather than the way it was in the German Reich, where the determination was done by experts working for the Reich Office of Genealogical Research. So again, this was another little loophole. Kalmar also accepted testimonies from Jewish persons, which was a no-no in Germany. So you can see how he created his own legal space. As you already know, I'm going back and forth between my own life and Kalmar, because we came from 2 different ends, but of course, eventually our stories meet. Let's see. In February of 1941, there was a little to-do in a Jewish ice cream parlor, and a Dutch Nazi was wounded, and the Germans took very severe retaliatory measures, which resulted in something that's pretty unique in the history of the occupied countries. There was a general strike in Amsterdam in February of 1941, where the Dutch more or less proclaimed that you dirty Germans, keep your dirty paws away from our dirty Jews. In other words, they really stood up for the Jews. There was a 2-day strike, which was really very heroic, and it's still commemorated in Amsterdam on February 29th. Every year there is a commemoration of the February strike. However, at that point already, some Jewish people, young men, were picked up and sent to Mauthausen. And Mauthausen was a very deadly death camp, to put it mildly. At that point, Udi, my boyfriend, went into hiding. Other people were not quite as quick in reacting, but in June of 1941, there was another big roundup of Jewish young men. These were young men who had gone to an agricultural school in the north of the Netherlands, where they prepared to go to Eretz Israel. And of course, the school was closed by the Germans the moment they came. But in May of 1941, they said they wanted to reopen the school with the Jewish council, which had been installed by the Germans. Please give them a list of the names of the young men who had been at the agricultural school, so they could be notified that they could go back. This was a ruse. They were all picked up and also sent to Mauthausen. The Germans arguing quite astutely that young men who were there by themselves without a family were the most likely ones to oppose the forthcoming measures they were going to take against all Jews. So that was another very strategic thing the Germans did. One of the young men was Rolf, my boyfriend's best friend. Rudi, I just refer to him as my husband because that's what he eventually became. Rudi and Rolf and my older sister and I had been on a lovely, lovely camping vacation in the summer of 1940 before the Germans started to do all the terrible things they did against Jews. And so the four of them were a quartet of who had a great time out in the countryside. And I described this in my book. But Rolf was one of the people who were picked up and sent to Mauthausen, and that was for Rudi the signal to go into hiding. So he was one of the first people to go into hiding as early as the summer of 1941. This laws against the Jews became more and more restrictive. In the fall of 1941, we could no longer go to general schools. We had again to go to Jewish schools, the same thing that we had gone through in 1935. We went through again in 1941. We were segregated out. We had only Jewish teachers. The school was, the teachers were all academically qualified, but most of them didn't have a teacher's training. They just had the academic knowledge you needed for an academic high school, but they had no idea how to handle teenage kids. And sometimes, I must say, those young boys in my class were absolutely abominable, teasing teachers and making a pest of themselves in a time that we were living in, I thought was unconscionable. And I actually stood up and lectured them. And when the whole class was punished for misbehaving, I went to the director of the school and said, I'm sorry, I have to help my mother. I can't afford to stay after school. That's just not, I'm certainly not one of the rowdy crowd. And the principal said, well, if you can't get your classmates to behave, then we'll lift the punishment, and I got them to behave. I really lectured them. I was furious, absolutely furious. So that was my ninth grade. Next, in the spring, in May of 1942, we had to start wearing the yellow star. It had to be sewn on your outer garment. People 6 years and older could not go out without a star sewn to their garments. So now we were really, what in America you would call tart and fatter. We were marked, and everybody in the street could see who was Jewish and who was not, which had some positive consequences because the majority of the Dutch were not anti-Semites, and they would sidle over to us and say, have you heard, the BBC had good news and so on. They were trying to encourage us. And the more measures we're taking against Jews, the more non-Jewish Dutch people try to be helpful. All in all, 25,000 Jews were hidden in the Netherlands, not just Anne Frank, but 25,000, of which at least 15,000 survived in hiding. That's the largest survival number, really. The others, the 10,000 who didn't survive, were not always betrayed. They sometimes betrayed themselves by not being careful enough, by being too close to the window, by quite often when they had to change hiding place, they were pale and anxious and betrayed themselves by their behavior. So about 40% of the people in hiding in the Netherlands were picked up and were sent to the camps in the east. Now, I don't know whether you know about the numbers, but the Netherlands had about 140,000 Jews at the beginning of the war. 110,000 were sent to the annihilation camps. 5,000 came back out of 110,000, which is less than 5%. And the Netherlands has by far the most Jews lost to the Holocaust of all of Western Europe, not Poland, but Western Europe. The question is often asked, why? And the answer is because the Dutch were such excellent bureaucrats. The system of registry in the Netherlands was even better than in Germany. The Germans admired it. Much good that it was, because we were all, there was a file card for every person, including profession, address, of course, profession and religion. So we were already registered. And the Dutch were very proud of the register. And some of the Dutch officials actually were helpful to the Germans. If it hadn't been for this registry, if it had been a little bit more sloppy, more of us could have easily escaped. The other reason why the Netherlands lost so many more Jews than Belgium and France is that Belgium and France were under a military German government, whereas we had a civil government. So I think what was not a military commander, but he was the Reichskommissar, and we were slated, the Netherlands were slated to eventually, after the war would be won by Hitler, we would be annexed by Germany and become part of the German Reich. So we had a more special treatment. Much good that it was. It was, of course, terrible. All right. I maybe should go back to my file cards and see what else I deemed important to tell you. Yeah, okay, let's now go to maybe how my family came to escape. I will startle you all by saying, hooray for bigotry, because it was bigotry that saved my life. My grandmother was a professional singer. She and her three of her sisters, from a large Catholic family in Austria, had formed a cappella quartet, and they sang all over Europe. from Russia to, I'm not sure about England, but all over continental Europe. And of course, they also sang in Germany. And when they came to Frankfurt, apparently, she struck up a relationship with a Mr. Blumenthal, who eventually wanted to marry her, and she wanted to marry him. Eventually, she was expecting a child from him. But Mr. Blumenthal's Jewish mother absolutely insisted that her son does not marry a non-Jewish wife. Very intolerant, very bigoted, and pretty awful. Yet, the son was an obedient son. He did not marry my grandmother until his mother had died, which was in 1919, 20 years after my mother was born. And that was exactly the loophole that my parents needed to tell Karlmeyer in his office that Mr. Blumenthal, yes, he said when he married my grandmother that this daughter was his child, but that was just a kindness of him so that the girl would finally be legitimized. But that did not mean that he really was the physical father. And Karlmeyer thought it was a good idea, and he granted the fact that my mother was born out of wedlock, clearly from a non-Jewish mother. And so he had his office. Is that my phone?
Yes, that's your phone.
Yeah, I had unplugged my desk phone, but not the living room phone. Okay.
We're with you.
Yeah, I'll unmute myself again.
No,
Okay.
you're good. It's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So, I have the paper in which he said the mother of this Mrs. Klein is clearly not Jewish, and my office is not able to do all the research that would be necessary to prove that Mr. Blumenthal was the father of this woman. And so hence I declare Mrs. Klein non-Jewish and her daughters as half Jewish. Of course, we never had a Jewish education. We did, but never mind. And so this is the way we could take off our yellow stars, hence the title of my book, Shedding Our Stars, in January of 1943, which was just in the nick of time. If you can imagine, my older sister, Susie, who was in 11th grade, was the only child left in her class, the only student. I was one of 5 or 6 in 10th grade. Every day, there were less children. We started out in September with normal classes, and every day children were gone, and we never knew whether they went into hiding or whether they were deported. But the classes were dwindling, and the teachers were trembling in their boots because they knew, of course, that once there were no students to teach, then they would be sent packing too. This was the way the system worked. Some Jews could stay because they were doctors, and as long as they were Jewish people in town, doctors were needed. There was a Jewish clinic also, there were Jewish teachers and so on. But as the population dwindled to 0, those people were sent packing too. So we got saved in the nick of time. Now, Rudy's parents did not go into hiding. He had prepared for them, but they were slow in deciding. They had a small drugstore. His father had been a pharmacist in Frankfurt, also West End Synagogue, the same synagogue that my father went to and that we went to. And he sang in the same children's choir as my sister and I. Anyway, the parents wanted to sell some more of what they had in the store inventory so that they would have money to tide them over. And they had just decided to finally go into hiding when they were picked up and sent to the transit camp Westerbork, the northeastern part of the Netherlands, close to the German border. and lasted there for 15 months, which was very long, because Westerbork had an infirmary. I mean, life is full of contradictions. There was an infirmary, and Mr. Nussbaum was the dispenser for the infirmary. And whereas, of course, practically everybody, the Jews were sent east, there were a few couriers that were allowed from Westerbork to come to Amsterdam to do essential business for the camp. And so actually Rudy's mother managed to get one of those courier permits and come to Amsterdam in August of 1943 to see Rudy once more and to try, get that, to persuade him to come to Westerbork, because young people there, while they worked, still had some free time and they played soccer and they looked healthy and they had a good time together, whereas Rudy had been in isolation, looked wan and pale and unhealthy, and was pretty miserable after having been in hiding for that many years. Rudy, of course, had nothing doing. I'm not going to go voluntarily to Westerbork. And he would have liked his mother to stay, but she couldn't do that, because if she did, if she had stayed in, and gone into hiding, then her husband would have sent packing immediately. So her husband, Rudy's father, was the hostage, so to speak. So she went back, and Rudy stayed behind, very, very sad, because he and his mother had a very special bond. And then he got stir crazy and wanted to do something. So he got in touch via his hiding father with the underground. And the underground at that point, which he didn't know exactly, were actually eager to find guinea pigs. All he wanted to know, is there something he could do to get out of the occupied country? And they gave him falsified papers, which had to be filled out very carefully. And he actually made it all the way to the Spanish border, posing as an agent for the Germans who had to buy equipment for the German submarines. He did this, I mean, it's unbelievable. Normally I read a passage where he describes, is there time for me to read that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, well, I try to find it quickly. I deviated from my notes because, so now it fixes for a moment. 95, 97. Okay. That's in his own words, which is, of course, much more authentic than if I'm telling. So he describes what happened first at the Spanish-French border on the French side. The person who was going to connect him to a passeur, a person to take him across the Pyrenees, did not show up. It turned out that there had been a betrayal, and it was he would have had to cross the Pyrenees on his own, which wisely he decided not to do, not because he couldn't hike, but because his French was school French and totally different from the local patois that people speak there. And the moment he would open his mouth, they would know that he didn't belong there. So he knew it was unsafe to cross by himself. So he filled out another set of papers to update them and traveled back to the Netherlands. And made the mistake, instead of going the long way around Maastricht, which is in the southeast of the Netherlands, he went directly from Paris to Brussels, thinking why spend more time in Wehrmacht trains, which is always, of course, dangerous. He was, after all, Jewish, and if anybody had commanded him pants down, he would have been caught. And so this was a pretty precarious situation. So that's why he decided to take the short route. And now I'll read him. When I came to the Belgian-Dutch border, I was made to leave the train and taken to the border police at the station. I tried to impress the officer on duty by voicing loud indignation. What were they thinking, taking me off the train when I had an all-important meeting the next day in Hamburg, where the Navy needed crucial parts for their submarines? My ranting distracted the officer from closely checking my papers, and he actually apologized for the inconvenience. I asked him how could I acquire his special permit that was apparently missing without having to return all the way to my home office in Paris. He helpfully suggested that I should go to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the Army in Brussels, just half an hour by train from the border. On the train back to Brussels, I chased 2 Belgian Hitler Jews out of the train compartment reserved for German military and their civil servants. I felt compelled to do that. My strength was that I could use the Nazi bark quite convincingly. It is impossible to describe how I felt. On the one hand, I knew full well who I really was. On the other, I had to slip into a totally different role. It was a matter of life and death. I was, of course, deeply conflicted about how to proceed, but decided eventually to go to the High Command of the German Army in Brussels to apply for the missing special permit needed to cross the border back into the Netherlands. The officer in charge told me to come back in an hour because my request and my papers had to be checked. That was the most dramatic hour of my entire life. While walking through this beautiful park in Brussels, there were these 2 inner voices. One said, "You are crazy. This is bound to go wrong." The other replied, "What better choice do you have to offer?" When I arrived back at the government building, the situation got even more dramatic. What did I see in front of it? One of the infamous green vans of the German riot squads. I thought it was waiting there for me. I went in and asked the officer, "Do you have my papers? Do you have my permit?" The man behind the desk got up and said, "Just a moment." He disappeared into another room. Was he getting the green police? Agonizing minutes passed, during which I had to keep a straight face. Finally, he returned with a friendly smile and said, "Everything is all right. Here are your documents. Hi, Hitler." I had an authentic special permit to cross the border issued by the Wehrmacht. Oh, this was pretty dramatic. Anyway, after Rudy returned, he knew the strength of these papers. The Dutch, bless them, are famous for their printing. Elsevier is an old, respected company, and in falsification of papers, the Dutch were just perfect. So he had false papers, and ever since October of 1943, he only went into summer hiding. He lived with his false name, with false papers, semi above ground, and managed to survive, really. Now, after it, maybe I should add, because it's somewhat unexpected for Peter. Anyway, I better just paraphrase it. For me, I was 16 at the time. It was a mixed blessing. I was, of course, very, very happy that he has survived this ordeal. He was only gone for 10 days, but I had been looking forward so much to just be a schoolgirl and not have to worry about him, because he was my responsibility, I felt all the time. And I thought, well, if he's safely gone, he was going to join the Allied forces and help liberate us. That's fine. And now he came back, and now I had to live as a 16-year-old schoolboy and as the trusted partner of somebody who was depending on me. So that made my growing up a pretty special and somewhat difficult time. I wouldn't want to trade it for anything else now, but at that time it was sometimes quite demanding. Okay, let me find my Who is gone? Well, I will just skip now to the hunger winter. I don't know how much you people in Johannesburg know about the end of the war. The Allied, as everybody knows, landed in Normandy on June the 6th of 1944. And they made quick progress all the way across Belgium, northern France and Belgium, to the across the Dutch border, all the way to the river Rhine, which flows from south to north through Germany and then has a 90-degree curve and goes through the Netherlands from east to west. So the Rhine was the border, how far the Allied forces got. The British still tried to get across the Rhine, but they were beaten near Arnhem. And the upshot was that while the southern part of the Netherlands was liberated in September of 1944, we, to the north of the River Rhine, were not liberated. We were cut off from everything. The coal that heated our electricity and what have you was in the southern part. We didn't get any food. The Dutch railroad was ordered by the Dutch government in exile to go on strike. So the Germans could not steal any more people and material. And so we were without any food. Our food rations eventually dwindled to 200 calories a day. Now, a normal person needs 2,000 calories. You cannot live on 200 calories a day. And people really in the winter of 1944-45 died like flies by the hundreds and thousands. Since I was the strongest one in the family, I went on hunger treks twice to get food for the family and brought some home. However, I was also a senior in high school. And again, the same phenomenon that I described in the Jewish school of a normal class that started in September of 1944. Eventually, we were only 5 or 6 of us very hardy ones who were left. The rest couldn't make it to school anymore. They were either sick or sent to the countryside by their parents. So school was dwindling away, except that our teachers did not have to fear to be sent to a camp, but they had to find food for their family too. The hunger winter was really, still is in the Netherlands, something that older people tell their children, so it's something that even younger people know about. It was absolutely awful. We ate tulip bulbs and fodder beets. Fodder beets I dug myself out of the dirt. They are very sweet and yucky, but they were meant for pigs. Tulip bulbs are bitter and awful to eat, but they do have some calories, so we ate those too. Anyway, the hunger winter was absolutely awful. Eventually, because of contagious diseases spreading all over the western and northern part of the Netherlands, the Germans allowed food droppings in the spring of 1945. And so British and Canadian and American airplanes came and dropped food without parachutes. So they had to fly very low. The Germans did not shoot on them, that was the agreement, and they dropped some food. And that was somewhat helpful, but it was really 10 days before the end of the war. The end of the war was in May 1945, so we had been under German occupation for exactly 5 years. Now, my book goes on and describes how we scrambled back to our feet, how terribly depressing after the acceleration of liberation, how terribly depressing the next weeks were, because that's when we found out about gas chambers and what had happened to all our friends and relatives, 2 sisters of my father, Rudy's parents, although we were very hopeful that Rudy's mother would survive, she had been able to get some Dutch forced labor to write postcards to my parents, telling them that she had been deported from Westerbork first to Auschwitz and then to Hamburg-Harburg. I don't think that many people know that actually Jewish women were used by the Germans to clear the rubble of bombed cities. I don't think that's general knowledge. But she sent us via some Dutch forced labor 2 postcards. So we knew that in August of 1944, she was still alive and near Hamburg. She was actually sent to Bergen-Belsen, and Rudy found her on the list of survivors. And he was, of course, elated, as you can imagine. By that time, Otto Frank had returned from Auschwitz via Odessa and Marseille. And he came back. I described how he came back and talked to us. You see. So for days, he knew that his girls had been sent from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen. And we all knew by then that Bergen-Belsen did not have any gas ovens. People died the natural way by the thousands. The natural way being typhus. But both Otto Frank and Rudy were very hopeful that their dear ones had survived. So they would go every day to Amsterdam Central Station, where trains came with survivors and asked people who struggled out, have you seen this woman? Have you seen these girls? And that lasted for several weeks that they did this daily, only to find out that Otto Frank heard from a Dutch woman that she knew for sure that first Margot and then Anne had died. And Rudy found out that his mother had died after liberation because the British were not prepared for the starving population. Whereas the Russians, the Soviet Russians in Auschwitz had nursed Otto Frank back to life, the British gave the starving people their K rations, which they couldn't digest. So people starved from being overfed after being totally starved, and they died. And Rudy's mother was one of those victims. So she did not come back. So here we were, 1945. I got my high school diploma. Rudy didn't even have a high school diploma. What was he going to do? Well, his uncle and aunt in South Africa, my connection to Johannesburg, had no children, and they very kindly offered to finance Rudy's studies. They wanted him to come to South Africa. They had a paint factory in Rudy. If Rudy would study chemical engineering, he would have his career made in South Africa. They very kindly invited him to come to South Africa in the summer of 1947 and treated him royally. But Rudy was absolutely horrified by South African racism. And he said, not for me. I'm not going to live in that country. Thank you very much for your offer, but no. And Rudy's uncle and aunt were, of course, very disappointed, but they were kind enough to send him a stipend every month so that he could study. And he studied physics. He became a nuclear physicist after he got his high school diploma. And then came the time that we had to decide where we really wanted to settle. We had spent 3 months in Liverpool, England, as a postdoc for Rudy, and then a year in Bloomington, Indiana, in the United States, with the 2 sons who were born in the meantime. I forgot that we got married in 1947, and that Otto Frank was our best man, Rudy's best man at the wedding. I should have said that. So our 2 sons came with us to Bloomington, Indiana, and loved it in America. Loved the free spirit and generosity of people. And so we went back. This was just for 1 year. Spent a year in Switzerland, in Geneva. Gorgeous, of course, but Switzerland is not a hospitable country. It's just a country for international trade and commissions and what have you, World Health Organization and so on, but not a place to stay. So then we decided, somewhat reluctantly, to move to the United States. And you know, this was 1957. It was the year of Sputnik. Nobody asked whether you were Jewish or not. A physicist, yay! He's going to help us against those wicked Russians. So we were made extremely welcome and never felt beholden to the United States because we went there on our own strength and not as refugees at all. In fact, we got quite active politically. I joined a Quaker meeting, became a pacifist, and when we joined a demonstration against the German finger on the nuclear trigger. Now that sounds like a mouthful, but in the meantime, the Americans had stationed nuclear weapons in Germany, and the Germans were going to have a certain amount of, I don't know what, input. And we were horrified just to think of that. And so we demonstrated against that. And a colleague of my husband in 1962 said, Rudy, I saw you in a demonstration and you are not even a citizen. What's that, Rudy? Is that important? Okay, we become citizens. So we applied for citizenship and of course got it right away. We learned what a little bit of history we had to learn. We did not swear allegiance to the American flag. We affirmed, because Quakers don't swear. We said that we were pacifists. Our two sons, 14 and 10, were asked whether they had a honest to goodness pacifist upbringing, which they had in Quaker Sunday school. And so when the Vietnam War started, our oldest son became a conscientious objector without any problem, because it was in his papers that he was raised a pacifist, which was, we didn't know about the Vietnam War in 1963, obviously. So anyway, we found we based our life in the United States on our own convictions and remained active in anything that had to do with anti-war movement and progressive causes. Rudy taught physics, and at one point, a student came up to him and said, Dr. Nussbaum, what do you think of the Trojan nuclear plant, which was a nuclear plant to create electricity? And Rudy said, by golly, I've never thought about it, but I'm going to sort it out and give it my attention. Well, he found out what some people already know, that the disastrous consequences of nuclear radiation. Low-level radiation has very terrible consequences for human health. He linked up with people who lived downwind from the big Hanford nuclear installation where the second bomb, the plutonium bomb, was built, and we became anti-nuclear activists from there on and have been active ever since. And it was in this framework that Rudy spoke at a conference in Münster, Germany, and then was asked by a participant of the conference to come to Osnabrück, because there was a chapter of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And would he please come and speak there, which he did. And it turned out that his host family, a pediatrician and his wife, knew that the teacher, the high school teacher of their oldest daughter, was working on a biography of Hans Kallmayr. I had not kept track of Hans Kallmayr. My parents had always awarded, or not awarded, that's the wrong word, no, expressed their gratitude to our Dutch lawyer by giving him a little gift every year for St. Nicholas, which is the Dutch main gift-giving holiday. And we had always thanked Mr. Cotting, his name, but we had not ever inquired beyond Mr. Cotting. So here in Osnabrück, Rudy learned for the first time that Hans Kallmayr, who was born there, learned more about his life, and that high school teacher of his new German friends, the first German friends we made, because we had a hard time making German friends. We were rather reserved, but these people were born after the war, so we couldn't possibly blame them for what Hitler did. So he learned that somebody was working on the biography of Hans Kallmayr. Next time I came along to Germany, we met the author, Mr. Nussbaum, and from the moment I heard of his intention, I said, well, if you ever, when you get done with the book, I'm going to translate it into English, because nobody in the Anglo-Saxon world has heard of Hans Kallmayr. Everybody knows about Schindler, who saved 1,200 people. Kallmayr saved many more, and it's about time that the world hears about him. Well, I don't want to go into too many details, but eventually the biography of was done in 2001. I have it, I looked at it, and I thought, oh my goodness, I cannot translate this into English, because bless Mr. Nussbaum, he was a leftist, and he used Kallmayr's life. Kallmayr was also left of center, definitely, but he used Kallmayr's history to also propound his leftist ideas about developments in Germany, and this would not fly in the United States. They are allergic to leftists in this country, unfortunately. So that wouldn't work. So I pleaded with Mr. Nussbaum, could you maybe write a shorter book with just Kallmayr and forget about all the ramifications that he saw in Kallmayr's life. And he very kindly obliged and wrote a shorter book, which I then translated. But even while I was translating, I realized it still has too much German politics. No American or nobody in Australia or South Africa or whatever is going to read it. It's just not geared to an international public. So I consulted some writer friends, and they suggested, especially Ursula Le Guin, who I don't know whether you know, but she's a rather famous woman writer. She said, Laureen, I know your story, intersperse your own story with Kallmayr's, and people will like it. So that's what I did, and the book got done finally in 2019, just before COVID hit. And I have had many very successful and pleasant book launches, but COVID spoiled it all. So now I'm sitting on 650 copies, which I hope that post-COVID I will finally be able to get to people. And that I'll end on this note and answer your questions.
Thank
Questions?
you, thank you, Laureen, for that riveting personal story. Rabbi Goldman is going to kick off the Q&A.
Thank you, Laureen. We very much appreciate you sharing your story with us. It's fascinating. It took me a while to get the hang of your accent, but if we did get there. So thank you. And you're living how many years in America? And you still don't sound American.
Well, no, I was too old. I was 30 when I came here. You don't change your accent when you are that old.
They tell me I don't sound South African either, so I understand.
Well,
I practice my American accent every night.
yeah, okay.
So I'm just curious, do you still have your yellow star?
Oh yes, I do have it, but I'm not right handy. Yes, I have my father burned one ceremoniously at the end of it all, but I still have one. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
You burned it, huh? Yeah. So,
what I didn't get to tell, and maybe I should have, is how Kallmayr ended up. I think I maybe owe it to him. I'm still connected, right? People can still hear me.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, he never bragged about what he did. In fact, only his wife and his son and one good friend knew what he had done in the Netherlands. He suffered the rest of his life for not having done enough. He always felt guilty that he couldn't save more people, and withdrew very much from public life. He was a successful lawyer, did many divorce cases, always was more of a reconciliation lawyer than a divorce lawyer. He had many cases of people who claimed restitution for things that happened in the Nazi time, but he did not find a very useful place in the New Germany. He found that the cleaning up of the Nazi past was done much too summarily under Adenauer, and that he felt alienated from what happened in post-war Germany very much, and died a recluse at a very young age in 1972. So he only got to be 69 years old.
That's very sad. We have Kalmeyers here in this community. I wonder if they're related.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. But he doesn't have any Jewish background. Kalmeyer.
Laureen, you mentioned to me that Yad Vashem has dedicated a tree in his honor.
Yeah, yeah, in 1992.
Were you part of that ceremony?
No. This was before I even knew. I only latched onto the Kalmeyer story in the late 1990s. This was before. That was Nussbaum's story, Mr. Nussbaum in Osnabrück. He actually started what they call the Kalmeyer Initiative, and they have been talking about Kalmeyer. But sadly, at this point, about a year ago in the Netherlands, a number of Jewish Dutchmen, and I'm very peeved at them, started an action against Kalmeyer, that he was actually part of the Nazi machinery, and as thought he should be condemned. He should have resigned his job and washed his hands clear of the Nazi machinery. But if he had resigned, all the cases that he adjudicated in favor of the petitioners would have been re-examined by his successor, and all of us would have been sunk. So it's a very callous movement, but they have been audacious enough to actually approach Chancellor Merkel of Germany to ask her to take away public German funds that were meant for a house of memory in Osnabrück, which was going to be called Kalmeyer House, and it would have Kalmeyer's story and exhibit, which is a very good exhibit, and other things that pertain to the war. And they don't want the name Kalmeyer on this house, so they are actually putting in I think, very nefarious action.
Who is the publisher of your book?
It's called She Writes Press. She Writes Press.
And will has it just been published? Is it available yet around the world?
It was published in October of 2019.
So it's been sold around the world?
Oh yeah. In fact, it's translated into Czech of all places. I don't know why the Czechs want it, but it has been translated into Czech, or it's being translated, I'm not sure.
So if you're interested, Shedding Our Stars, a reference to the yellow star that Laureen wore at first and then was able to remove, and her life was saved. So
I've just received a message. It's on Amazon, which I imagine would also be through Take-A-Lot, Amazon books.
Oh, I'm very cross at Amazon, but okay, go ahead. They kill all the small bookstores. If you have a reasonably good bookstore in Johannesburg, which you should, have them order it. I'm sure they can order it. It has been ordered in Australia and in other countries, I know. I would prefer that because Amazon is really...
Amazon isn't really here that much, so
Say that again?
You don't have to worry about Amazon in South Africa at the moment.
No? Well, good. Why not?
Because they're not so busy here. We have other companies that do this work.
Okay, well, Amazon is...
Laureen, was that common in other areas of Europe to have a father wearing the star and the rest of the family sort of exempt from that?
Oh yeah.
Was that maybe a reflection once again of how precise the Dutch were, and was that common in other areas of Europe?
No, it was all over Europe, occupied Europe, also in Germany, yes. the Jewish partner of a mixed marriage had to wear a star. Definitely.
But the rest of the family could roam freely.
Yeah. Well, if the children had not been educated in the Jewish faith, which is hard to prove. Yeah.
Yes, fascinating.
Well,
But,
even us Jews have difficulty determining who is a Jew sometimes.
Yes, I know.
The
I know.
Germans had their own criteria.
Yeah, right. I know that because of the Jewish law being different from the general law. Yes, of course.
And were there many survivors in Portland?
Well, we were people who were willing to serve at the Speakers Bureau. We were about 2,000 people, but they're dying out, and there are very few left now. I'm just one of the last Mohicans.
Are you familiar with the Yiddish expression canine horror?
Say it again?
Canine horror. Have you heard that expression?
No, I don't know that. No.
It's like the equivalent. It's like the equivalent of touch wood.
I see. Okay.
So you're looking pretty good for your age. So well done.
Thank you.
And a very articulate presentation.
Well,
I understand that in August you celebrate your next birthday. So
yes.
may that come around in good health.
I hope so. I promised my youngest grandson to be around for his wedding next year. So I better
Congratulations.
I better stay alive till
May
June
you
of next
keep
year.
the promise in good health.
Thank you. I was hoping I would see Renee on this, but I don't see her.
Hold on. You can see Renee. Just give me a moment. Renee, put on your camera if you can, and we'll pull up Renee as well, just to say hello here. And we thank Renee for putting us in touch with you. Renee, if your camera goes on, I can add you to the screen so that we can connect the two friends from across the world. We'll see how that goes. Just before, oh, here we go. Okay, Renee, 1 second. There we are. Renee, 1 second. I'm gonna unmute you.
I don't see her. Maybe,
if you go to,
I have to use my arrow.
Hold on. If Laureen, on the top corner, if you go to top right corner, it says view. You can press on speaker view or gallery.
Well, I'm looking at all the names on top, but I don't see it. Oh, here I see Renee. Is that her?
Renee, is this Renee.
Ah, okay. Hi. Hello. No, we meet because we have never met.
Oh, you've never met in person? Well, let's see if Rita. There's Rita.
Oh, yes, I know Rita. Where is she? Oh, she disappeared.
Hi, Laureen.
I don't see you. You're
on the same screen as Renee. There we go.
Hi.
Oh, here she is. Hello. Hello, Rita. Hi. Yeah.
How are you?
I always give her a hard time because I don't understand her. Okay.
It's the accent.
She says we'll speak on the phone.
All right. Well, thank you for reconnecting us. That's very nice. I appreciate that.
Okay.
I'm also happy to be your Shabbos guy, really.
She's awesome.
Oh boy. Thank you. I want to say thank you to Laureen for joining us and being so willing to share. And I think this is so important, the education of the calamities and the Holocaust that you experienced, and the resilience to see someone who can share with us of how you overcame the tragedies of the Holocaust is extremely inspiring for one and all. And it gives us on a day like Tisha B'Av the sense of resilience and push and positivity to be able to rebuild after destruction, after tragedy. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of this.
No, you're most welcome. And all the very best to have unrest there too, like we have here. So I hope things will develop for a better world. We need it really very much. Okay. Okay,
gonna-
I'm opting.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
Okay. You're
Thank
all very welcome, and I'm going to opt out.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. Just to conclude, to everyone one and all, we have a program lined up for tomorrow morning for Tisha B'Av, 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock. 10 o'clock, we'll be having a few minutes of communal kinnis lamentations as a community for 10 minutes. And then we welcome our first guest speaker, my mum, who you've met and heard from before, Minna Stern of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. She'll be sharing a topic which is quite intriguing on the hidden children of the Holocaust. And that will be followed by shiurim and classes by Rabbi Goldman and then myself between 10 and 12. You can join us there to add some content, some education, some inspiration perhaps to the Tisha B'Av day as well. And then in the afternoon, there's a joint communal-wide tefillin get-together at 4:30 because we don't put on tefillin in the morning. So 4:30, we'll share that on the WhatsApp group, of the Shul WhatsApp group. It's 4:30 tefillin get-together across the country. And we'll be having our own Mincha Mariv get-together with some words of Torah in between at 5:15. And the fast ends tomorrow evening at 5:59. Thank you all for joining. And good evening. Thank you.